Hello, Diogo.
Hello, Francesco.
Ciao to everybody. Hello to everybody.
Nice to meet you.
Nice.
So I would say we could start once Natasha is also here. Okay, great. So very nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to have this conversation together with you. So welcome to the Architecture Triggering Interaction session. My name is Diogo Aguiar. I am from Porto University, and I will be the moderator for this session. I will start by doing a very short introduction of each one of the present speakers. Francesco Saverio holds a master's degree in architecture at Politecnico di Milano, is a PhD at Architectural School of University of Genoa. From 1987 to 1991, he worked at Aldous Rossi's office, and he was involved in different projects. He is actually a full professor and coordinator of the master degree in architecture of the University of Bologna. Vanja Riester, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Vanja Riester graduated at the Architectural Faculty University of Zagreb in 1999. He is currently an associate professor at the Department of Architectural Design, Architectural Faculty in Zagreb. He is engaged in architectural practices, taking part in architectural competitions, designing and building mostly in public and educational typology. Antonis Papangelopoulos, which I don't think it's very correct, but okay, holds a diploma in architecture and a postmaster's degree in research in architectural spatial design from the National Technical University of Athens. He has collaborated with multiple architectural practices in Greece and abroad, participating in projects of wide programmatic diversity, ranging from housing to public use complexes. He is currently engaged in research on questions of spatial justice, focusing on the intersections between aesthetic practice, urban design, and the commons. He is a co-founder of Studio Ennio. Natasha Isso is a PhD candidate at the Architectural Research Laboratory in Toulouse. After 2 years of master on the heritage thematics, her thesis questions the 20th century heritage. Her thesis deals with different notions about particular heritage, such as recognition, protection, or valorization. Malan Chung is a PhD candidate in the Architecture and Urban Heritage Conservation at the Architectural Research Laboratory of the National School of Architecture of Toulouse in France. Prior to start her doctoral, she taught a course in architectural science at the university in Cambodia and has been an assistant lecturer in architecture workshop and architecture conservation courses in Royal University of Fine Arts, Cambodia. She is interested in preservation and restoration of heritage buildings, but also in the urban conservation and the development of landscape area. Francesco Caneschi is a PhD candidate at FAUP and DIDA, and his thesis project is entitled Global Tools, Temporary Actions in Urbanism and Architecture. His research interests are radical architecture and incremental urbanism, and is involved in the organization of the archive of Titi Manchetto, co-founder of the radical architectural group UFO. So welcome you all. After this small introduction, I would like to make you some questions. So the questions are open to all of you. So the ideal would be to get your feedback on these questions. So the first question is, of course, very related with the moment we are all passing through. So in the exact post-moment when social conviviality seemed to definitely have shifted to the virtual space, what strategies should be adopted today so that the physical space may once again promote the encounter and the interaction, recovering its social and political dimension? I would ask the guests to answer eventually by the order of the introduction. So I would pass the word to Francesco Saverio.
Thank you, Diogo. Well, I'm the oldest one, so probably I'm supposed to be the last one, you know, like, thank you for asking me to be the first. And thank you for your question that, like we say in Italy, are domandine, are very, we are using ironically this term because are very, very, intriguing and very complicated question, and especially to answer in 3 minutes each question. But I understand that this is the timing we have, so I try to be in this. Well, I think that, like Marc Fumaroli wrote a few years ago, we as a society, our society lost the convivialities. And for sure, because of the pandemic, this was even worse, became even more complicated. But this is probably something that involved the type of society in which we are working on. And I don't think, and then maybe in the question number 2, we will have the opportunity to getting deeper to that. I don't believe that, like it was in the avant-garde of architecture, that the architecture will save the world. We, as an architect, we can think about that, but definitely I don't believe it. I think that we, as an architect, can just give answer to the needs of the people, but we need to have the people that tell us what they want. I don't think that charge of ideology, even if we need of ideology, of course, the architecture will be the right way of, or the helps to make good architecture. But the problem is to design space where the people can act. Our architecture, in my ideas, but that was an idea that comes from the Italian tendenza with Rossi, Monestiroli, Grassi, and even before Rogers, Ernesto Nathan Rogers, they used to say that the architecture is the place where the human being can act. So we need to provide space where the people can do. And the architecture should be, in positive, should not be something where we can predict what there will be in that place. We knew several places, and even in the speech we just heard before us, we saw factories transform into exhibition spaces or other buildings thought for other functions that now are schools, are theaters, wherever, and so. But they work because they are space that they can be reused for that. So I think that it's very important to refound the socialities, the convivialities, as you asked to us, but this is something that belongs especially to the young generation to reform the society, the capitalist society in which we are working. We knew that the young people in the US, I was reading an essay on the realism capitalist by Mark Fisher that says that almost the 80% of the young US people doesn't think that the capitalism should be transformed, but this is the way in which they will love. And so that means that the commercial centers are the places where to live, but I don't think that this is supposed to be the new way. So we cannot change the society. We can provide the space for the society, and I want to be provocative in this with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Vania, I would like to comment on the question, but also if you want to relate with Francesco's feedback.
Yes, of course. As we all prepared for the same question, I must say that I agree with Francesco's primal idea. Certainly, an architecture is a discipline that has a limited influence on trends in general, and especially of social interaction. But on the other hand, it's very much able to shape and steer those trends once they're already present. Once we have a society that wants something or moves in a certain way, then architecture can respond to that. I feel we need to accept that a part of our lives, a part of our social interaction that was previously almost exclusively physical has gone to the virtual realm. The reasons are probably convenience, efficiency, now safety concerns because of the pandemic, etc. They're all driving this trend, and this trend is seemingly irreversible. But we should not focus here on this negative aspects of virtual interaction. Even this conversation is possible and we're having it now in virtual realm, in its squeeze between the events of our own physical lives in different cities in Europe. Also, as we have seen in this pandemic, the need of humans as biological beings is of close physical contact with other humans. And the virtual place cannot replace those needs in no possible way. So maybe we should study what types of encounters thrive well on virtual and which are seriously lacking in quality and in scope. And that analysis will inform us on those types of interaction that need physical space and buildings or urban spaces to happen in. I feel that those encounters will be maybe in future more local than in the past, but they might be more meaningful because a lot of technical stuff or mechanical stuff will be brought online. Probably in physical public buildings and urban settings, we need to promote the same concept. We all know the parameters that enhance interactions. Those factors are like more density, inclusivity, safety of people using the space, comfort, especially climate comfort, and relatable space or meaning. The people should find meaning in the space they interact in. All those factors are pretty much self-evident drivers of interaction. Also, I feel that in uncertain future, assessing possible multi-purpose use of as much as possible of the built space should be one of the priorities. Especially communication spaces and interstitial spaces are interesting because people meet there unintentionally and interact in an unstructured manner. So hallways, corridors, streets, squares should be designed with this multi-use in mind, as they probably always were. Maybe a good place to start the discussion are our educational facilities, from schools all the way to university buildings, because they plant seeds of the future generational habits. In school typology, we should probably promote interaction by concentrating and not dispersing, by providing less purpose-built classrooms and space and more generous spaces for spontaneous use, for informal work, for interaction. And also we should encourage openness of school spaces to local communities by engaging some of its facilities in communal services that goes beyond school's primary program or function. In this way, our institutions will be connecting with the public, and the public will be richer for another space of interaction.
Thank you, Vani. I think that's actually great. So I would like to incite the same question to ask Antonis if he also believes that architecture has many predictions, and maybe we have to consider spaces more spontaneous, more informal. Is this the way that the physical space will get once again is social and political dimension? What do you think about this?
Yeah, sure. This is certainly one thing. This is certainly one aspect that we may look into. But yeah, the big, in my opinion, question here is for whom? I mean, first of all, I feel I have to say again openly to this panel that my research focuses on questions of commons and spatial justice. So I would say that there is a big, huge question in this form of approaching the urban phenomenon, which is, for whom do we actually design? For whom do we actually build? In which political and social conditions? And what our work actually means to several actors involved in the urban phenomenon, and so on. So I don't know. The first question for me, therefore, would be, what kinds of interactions are we really after? For example, talking about the South European metropolis, for example, we have during the last 3 or 4 years this phenomenon of touristification. I mean, Athens has become a prime destination, amassing over 5 or 6 million visitors per year. Therefore, one central question would be, who we really want to have connections to, who we really want to share with the city space, and in which manner, actually, in what mode of operation, in what mode of common inhabitation. So this is a huge distinction, in my opinion, that needs to enter this conversation. But also talking about physical space and digital space, so to say, we have all experienced 2 years or more of relative isolation in physical terms, at least. And now there is now several trends have emerged, such as digital nomads and so on and so on. What I would like to point out, firstly, would be that what we are experiencing is always a return to the physical, to the tangible, no matter how many digital strata of communication enter our everyday lives. So I assume that we always want to return back to a more meaningful experience of space, which is therefore a more meaningful experience with people. So starting this conversation, I would like to bring forward this question. Who do we want to experience space with?
Thank you, Antonis. I think that's actually a very, very important topic. You're probably suggesting abandoning top-down strategies and focusing on bottom-up strategies, more relating to the real people, to the real inhabitants of the space. And so I will ask Natasha, if so, what does she think about this? How would you consider the importance of recovering the political dimension of the public space?
Yes, thank you. I agree with this differencing, and I think it's very important to ask for whom do we actually build. And I think this period is very interesting to take into account what it works and what it doesn't work today in the public and the private spaces. And I think this health crisis is very complicated for us as users and as architects to understand the city and to have a new reflection about spaces. I think all the people realize that virtual spaces interaction have their limits, and everybody needs to have real interaction in real spaces, but what kind of interaction in what kind of spaces? And I think this questioning and tension period can allow us to question some new things and realize new kind of spaces. If I take an example about social housing, because it's my subject of research, people who live in today say that the exteriors of the social housing was said that it was non-used spaces before the COVID, and today they said that it's a very important kind of spaces for us, because when it was when the COVID was very important in the city, all the people had a place to go and to speak about all the people, and it was a very important thing for us. And I think this kind of very close spaces around the house and around the apartments, it's very important to have conviviality and to have a new kind of appropriate spaces. So I think we must have a reflection about this kind of spaces, like a social and a spatial kind of elements. Yes, this kind of in-between spaces need to be interrogate and have a reflection about it to make yes, new common and new public spaces for all the people who use it.
Thank you, Natasha. So I think we are clearly also talking about these vague spaces, the in-between spaces where the social encounters really happen. So we are getting away from the idea of the institutionalized spaces.
Yes.
And I would ask Malan Chung what she would like to add to the topic.
Yeah. For me, I think beside all other speakers put in this topic, but I think that everyone admitted that the pandemic has been given a great bad impact all around the world in a different dimension, including health, economic, social, and fiscal. And we indisputable agree that development has been given attention, postponing of and we neglect more or less during this hardship. And now we are gradually approaching to recovering to the situation where the pandemic disappeared. So anyway, this time this time in the social, we also can benefit by step back and action by the observing on the space, the public space, do the monitoring and providing the diagnostic, meaning we give the feedback to what we have learned from the isolation, like we're doing now. And then secondly, we try to understand from up to the regional level of local context, like the other speaker said, we have to understand what the space that we build for. And we can see, and then we can see the slightly impact on the change to the society in development level. And this point, we require all the local, global understanding of. And the last but not least, I would say that we could idea of the vision and give the practice or the plan in the next step. So for my I would conclude that the first we could do the diagnostic analysis and try to understand all those aspects, all those practice, give the feedback, and then we visioning it together and planning for the implementation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Malan. So I would emphasize the idea of are we learning something after the COVID experience, after the pandemic? Are we building differently from now on? Malan emphasized the importance of local networks. Francesco, what do you think? Is there a new way to think the public space?
I mean, after the beginning of the pandemic, the public space closed. But the problem is that public space is not only square meters, it's physical, but also conceptual. It's the space where with our body, we express our political will every day with every action. The presence of our body in public space is political. Like in New Public Space in NRA wrote, without public space, power becomes domination and the state becomes the interpreter of a social control, and public opinion becomes the place for manipulation. In fact, when we were in lockdown, public administration had the complete control over public life. So we could say that public space is actually the space controlled by public administration. I think that there are many authors and architects that are using to privilege the definition of common space instead of public. For example, Stavridis, that I think Antonis Stavros Stavridis, distinguish common space and public space as understood as distinct. Common space is understood as distinct from public space, as well as from private spaces. Common spaces emerge in the contemporary metropolis as sites open to the public use, in which, however, rules and form of use do not depend upon and are not controlled by a prevailing authority. So the common spaces are spaces where a group of people, a collectivity, shares behaviors and rules and define something that is unexpected. This is why I think that the only way to express the political is actually to have spaces where we can decide something else than what is already decided or designed, for example, by architects. And there are ways to do that, and like other authors, for example, privilege the definition of tactics instead of strategy, based on the work of Desserteau, because it's only if they have the freedom to decide something that people will decide something. I don't know if I mean, encounter and interaction are the basic features of urbanity. And to develop them, there should be more open sites where to experiment without the rules that strictly regulate the use of public space.
Thank you, Francesco. What you're actually defending, it's aligned with another question I would have to make you all. Architecture is a social act, especially if there is awareness that when we are creating a building, we are also defining the void that it separates us from the others, configuring public space. The question is there room for empty spaces when we are thinking about the design of public space? Are we over-designing public spaces? I think this is very related with the topic you're actually approaching, Francesco. So if you want to go the other way around, so that Francesco Saverio, which is the oldest, is now the last one answering the question. If you would like to develop your idea, growing on this idea of over-designing public spaces, we are actually determining what people are doing on the public space, and maybe we are distancing from the common space concepts you were defending. Would you like to grow on top?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. In fact, my first answer was actually an answer to the last question, probably. But there is a great sentence by Foucault about public space that actually not really known. But Foucault said, he answered to this question: do you think that architecture can introduce positive effects into the physical world? And the answer was, I think that architecture can produce and does produce positive effects when the liberating intention of architecture coincide with people's real practice in the exercise of their freedom. It means when we enable people to develop and explore their freedom, architecture is useful. Architecture is not always social. It's not. I don't think that architecture is a social act. I think that architecture can be a social act. That means that if
that also depends on what's architecture.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, architecture with a capital I, isn't it? But and I think that more and more people actually, more architects actually understand how to develop experiment in the public space that can actually involve the actors of the place into the building of their own space. And even obviously the architect is useful. I mean, if we have to develop a project in an abandoned space to liberate the collective imagination, the work of an architect is useful with a concept that shows something unexpected or that can attract people because it's something new. But there is always a need, I think, to involve the people who will inhabit that place in the building of that place. I'm talking about a small scale right now, but at a bigger scale, I think that many examples are useful. For example, in New York, where the New York City Plaza program, or in Milan, the Piazza Aperte. I think that there is a way to scale that. And about the void, I think that the thing is, there is a word in German that is Freiraum. That means free space, but also in a conceptual way. And it was the motto shared by all the Protestants of Tempelhof when every time that the municipality want to build in Tempelhof, but it's actually a Freiraum. It's a huge open space full of possibilities. And I think that the architects should be tools for people to appropriate the space. Is a bit like Lefebvre used to say, participation does not mean anything. The real meaning of participation is self-management. In a small scale. There is a little scale, obviously, I think, in urban.
Thank you, Francesco. I would now ask someone if they want to follow Francesco's intervention.
Yes, if I can say something. Well, I believe the architecture is a social act, even if it's what we call edilizia or building. And it's very different from art. It's an art, but it's art of architecture. And sometimes in architecture, we confuse and we see project that seems to be more piece of arts or design, industrial design, than architecture. And this is because everyone that walk in a street is looking at the building, can see the building. So this has a strong social impact. That's why I believe that architecture, any kind of architecture or just construction, is a social act. That's why I think it's very important to have a architecture that should be decided by the community, and the community express the politician, and this gives the rules of the architecture. I think one of the problems of our towns, or the towns after World War II, especially in Europe, after the war, after the disruption that we had, and the problem of the reconstruction was that, especially after the totalitarianism that we had in Italy as a fascism, for instance, there was a total freedom in building, but I believe that destroyed the urban pattern, destroyed the hierarchies that's supposed to be in the towns. And we are still living in many places this attitude in the construction of the town, where we leave to the builders, to the businessmen to organize by themselves that space. Instead, I think, like it happened also in Berlin, in the opposite of what happened in Berlin after the wall collapse, that the town, even for private side, was holding competitions. This means that there was a debate on the form of the town. Instead, we lose this, let me call it, probably I'm using a wrong word, a political control, means a control of the society that wants and lives in that town. Normally in what's happening in Italy is leaving to the business, the construction of the town. And many architects that are following this without any kind, with cynicism in their relationship, just answering what the Lord, want the owner of that place to build. Instead, even a private neighborhood should be designed after some rules that the community supposed to give. So I think that the town built as a singular piece of art, they create a sort of Esperanto, and in our towns we lose the quality of the places. We lose the memory of the places. We are living a new international style that I think we should fight as an architect in terms of construction, the globalization of the architecture. I don't understand why the same architecture should be done in US or in China or in Italy. I believe that each old country is supposed to have its own identities. This is not to affirm new nationalism. I don't want to say that, opposite to that. But if I'm going to France, I would like to eat the French food, or if I go in German or in Greece, souvlaki, and not to eat pizza if I'm in Greece, even if I can find probably a better pizza in Athens than in Italy, but just say, and sometimes architecture is that. So we as an architect, that's why I believe, and maybe I'm getting too long and I quit. We have to look at the history of the architecture, the history of the town, of the architecture. And you were asking if we can learn from the typologies, the historical typology. I think yes, but transforming that by rethinking that in the progressive way, not just in a sort of nostalgia way, but founding the new relationship. Like Henrik Stessenhoff used to say, since the dog will go underneath a stove for eating itself, we don't understand why we're supposed to change a room. Or Adolf Loos used to say, any new invention, typological talking, is good if this is an advance, is something that change in a better way. But unfortunately, we saw several experimentations that they were failed. They were then destroyed. And I remember the Great Britain unions that they asked to the RIBA, please quit doing experimentation on our life. We want to have a row houses with our garden. And they stop here.
Thank you, Francesco. So I would emphasize the idea that cities are losing identity to the globalization of architecture, that we are no longer considering the specificity of the site, and that architecture is losing its field to the builder's business. So we are no longer the critical thoughters of the public space and the way that people actually live. Having said this, I would ask any other guests to intervene if they are wanting to. I don't know. Antonis?
Sure. I think it's only fair to ask architects to stay out of people's businesses, and unless they're actually asked to. And that's a huge discussion because, you know, recounting Francesco's argument, in Greece, we had the same form of development of let's say, post-war reconstruction, in Marx, yeah, which was actually fueled by private contractors in a way that Athens of the 1940s and Athens of the 1980s is a totally different landscape in all possible ways imaginable. But yeah, so this is actually, I had to point out that we share a very, very common history in those terms. Another thing that we may share in common, I'm not sure about Italy in particular, but it's surely true about Greece, is that we never had culture of common public space. We don't use public space, where we actually, in a sense, hate what we have to share with others. And in those settings, it was quite a new thing to see during the pandemic that you had those major parks in the center of the city actually rejuvenated by the presence of thousands every weekend or in afternoons after work and so on. You had those places flooding with people, which is something that has never happened before. And right after the lockdown period ended, those public spaces were again empty and void, so to say, which is a huge question here. I mean, how can we invent in the middle of an extraordinary condition new ways to share, even if they don't last for too long? And yeah, the strange thing about those places that were the first time that were actually used was that they were places of negotiation, in the sense that they were actually inhabited by the different tribes, so to say, of peoples, without any central authority coordinating their movements or their choices or their ways of using space. So yeah, in a sense, this could actually go down as a prime example of space commoning, where space is practiced, space is under a constant form of negotiation, and there's no central authority that actually drives those interactions between all those actors and so on. And then again, it's quite interesting to see how this thing stops all of a sudden, like the way that it came to life in a very short period of time. So yes, architecture is a social act, but this has nothing probably to do with architects themselves, with the industry of architecture. And this is an important distinction to make here. And yeah, I myself many times find it very difficult to see those interconnections, or more probably, how can a professional in architecture take advantage of such knowledge. And yeah, this is a great divide, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Antonis. I think that's awareness of its political acts when designing whatever building, and the conscience of its impact on the public sphere. It's already something, while negotiating with the builders, for instance. I don't know, but I would ask Natasha what she would like to grow on top of this conversation.
Yes, maybe I can speak about different problematics about public spaces in my example of large housing complex, because I think it's very interesting to learn about this kind of spaces, because like I said before, they propose a new kind of scale of public spaces, because I think they are in the middle of a complex. So it's a public spaces, but for everybody, but made in particular to people who live in the complex. And I think this kind of reflection about scale, it's very interesting and very important to have a different approach of these spaces, to have yes, a new reflection about use and users, and a reflection about yes, maybe definition of boundaries and uses for maybe sorry, smaller scales in this kind of moment with the COVID. I think if we need to think about smaller scales to have a reflection of the city. And yes, maybe I can add just another idea, that I think it's important to think about the empty spaces which need to be appropriate by people, and what kind of people, and the same reflection about full spaces and empty spaces. I think it's a very difficult thing, but to think about public spaces, I think it's very interesting to think about that and to make sense in the empty spaces. Yes.
Thank you, Natasha. I will now ask Vania if he wants to add something to this topic. We've been talking also now about the importance of scale and diversity, I would say, and some kind of vagueness of this public spaces. What is your opinion on this topic?
Well, I feel that especially in our southern countries, southern European countries, open public spaces are almost like an institution. We in Zagreb experienced the same Antonis described, that during the pandemic, when everything inside was closed, all the outside places of the city were occupied by different age groups, different professionals, people from different backgrounds that kind of felt safe and felt invited to use streets and parks and curbs and stairways and whatever for just hanging out or discussing, for a change from school or cafes or restaurants they used before. And this kind of egalitarian space where you can meet anybody is very interesting. And it also, like in Athens, changed when everything opened up. People went back to their own places where they usually spend time together. And I don't know, architecture as a way to define this or stir this movement is very slow by its nature. I don't know, maybe it's because of all those resources need to build, or because of the regulation now, or the building of public consensus about what architecture or place is. So I don't know how we can speed all this up and find answers from architects' culture, both in terms of public acceptance of some new paradigmatic ideas or the pace of advancements in built space. But we should certainly broaden the scope of architectural thinking as not only designing or building buildings, but much more as a broader strategy of using space, of making policies, as we're discussing now, of managing space use, and maybe being as an architect much more political. And discussing the void spaces between buildings, which, as I said, are extremely important in our oral cultures. From perspective of my country, I don't feel we are over designing it. Actually, I think we are neglecting it, and especially in line of climatic changes, of more heat waves or weather that we're not used to. We may need to pay even more attention to our open air spaces in such a way, finding new technology to promote sort of assisted climate, to be able to enjoy our open air life as we did before.
Thank you for your feedback, Vanya. I would like now to ask Malin Chung what she wants to add on the topic.
Yes, from what the other speaker already put in, I noticed that I would go to, Mr. Ferra idea. He put that the architecture designed by the community, and I also thinking about that. And another one opinion from Antonis. He stands on the political act in the public space or the architectural practice. So I would say in my case study that I research on now in one public space, like one big architectural building of the city. Now in Cambodia, actually it's not in a European country, but anyway, the problem happened in similar in around the world. So now the challenge and the pressure put on the city, and it's because of the use of the public space, the use of the community. But in Cambodia, it's different because or the designer doesn't have any a lot of effect on the development, but the political act has a lot of impact, and because of the country is in the political constraint, so there is not any high effective from the architecture or from the designer. So I would say that it's really important to looking at to try to the architect or the technical, and we should hear the voice or the demanding from the community and compromising between the design from the architect and the community, also from the political aspect. Now in Cambodia, it's really hard to give or to find because of the education constraint, the political unstable, and sometimes the community doesn't have any voice, or they don't have the education on the living. So it brings a lot of pressure, and it's a good topic for me to learn. I would say that the architect could do a lot of things, like giving the idea, or could be a leader on the aspect of architecture of the public space or in development. But somehow the compromising between those factors has to be met. Thank you.
Thank you, Malin. The last question is a set of different questions. It's very open. So I actually found it very curious that the interest of the panelists here present today was varying between the observation of the persistence and recognition of the built heritage, the programmatic exploration of architectural typologies today, or the use of subversive or collaborative strategies present in the ephemeral or social intervention architecture. So I'm interested in provoking the intersection or the overlapping of this interest, and to ask you if the coexistence of them could actually fine-tune a more adaptive future capable of learning from flexible trial and error strategies. So could the built heritage benefit from a typologic or programmatic reinvention, or even from a provocative ephemeral intervention? Can a new social typology be born by testing micro-social intervention architectures and identifying the new need of new public uses? Facing an ever-mutating world, should we question architecture's paradigmatic notions such as permanence and programmatic prevalence? I would now open the question to the first interested in answering.
It's me again.
Yeah, for sure, Francesco.
Okay. No, I didn't. Okay. The question of this question is very, very open and quite obviously huge. I found very interesting the part of trial and error, and I tried also to link my answer to the previous answer of Francesco and Antonis. One of the main example, one of my sto parlando. Bye. One of the excuse me, I have a shared office now. It's a bit messy everything. One of my favorite example, of course, were reconstruction was where Aldo Van Eyck's playgrounds, but actually were think as a trial and error by statement, also by the statement of Van Esteren, that was head of the urban part of the urban office of the municipality. The playgrounds had to be temporary, and they changed a lot in response to the request of the people. There is a beautiful book with all the letter that the people sent to the office. And there is also, for example, a note of Van Esteren, the chief of the office, that wrote down that they had to change the sandpit of a playground because they were asked to by the people. So this is trial and error, and it started with I think with the void of the post-war with Van Eyck and Van Esteren. That is why I like the definition of incremental urbanism, because it's it means of relate or occurring in especially small steps. I mean, I think that is a good practice to build a thing, test it, increment it. I think it's a good approach, a soft approach. Also about typologies, I mean, a lot of typologies that define and characterize our urban environment were developed during the industrialization, or in some part of the history of architecture. I think that we could rediscover new typologies. For example, covered public space in Porto will be a huge positive influence about the city because it rains a lot, for example. But with a link to the heritage, for example, in Florence, the loggias shaped the city during the Renaissance. But right now they are not at disposal. They are not used by the citizen because it's impossible, because they are filled with tourists. So also the built heritage has meaning only if people who inhabit that place give it a meaning, and that meaning can also change. But there had to be a relation between who live a space continuously and not for a week, a year, and the typologies that place has. Right now, nobody uses the loggias, but in the in the 15th century, but were one of the places where many diaries of the time say most political movements were born in Panchedivia and Loggia, that are the benches. So I think that the relation is always between architecture and the users.
Thank you, Francesco. I would like now Natasha for commenting on this very vague question.
Yes, maybe I can say something about. I agree with Francesco about the need of to make evolution about heritage in accord to the today's and tomorrow needs, and in particular with the needs of the users and the habitants. And I think today we need to have a co-construction to transform our heritage in accord to the multiplicity of the people who live, who use, who think about the spaces. And yes, I think it's important to think about new strategies to transform and to build the city and the spaces and the housing in the reflection about adaptability and evolution of the spaces. Yes, and yes, I think we need to ask people who lived in and used the space. Yes, I don't know what to add. Yes, maybe to create meeting places and attractiveness, we need to interrogate all the users.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
We are running out of time. We have like 5 to 10 extra minutes. So I would like to ask Antonis what he wants to add on this topic.
Yes, while I was listening the other speakers now, I remembered once I lived in Lisbon for a while. And yeah, there was back then, 2013, 2014, this campaign titled Aqui Podia Viver Gente. I hope I'm pronouncing it kind of correctly. Here we could have people living.
Yes, aqui podia viver gente.
Aqui podia viver gente. Okay, yeah, well noted. Yeah, and back then there were several empty houses in Lisbon downtown. Actually, that during this time they were negotiated by activists and political movements of the city as spaces that could actually potentially house people and so on and so forth. Back in those days, Lisbon was quite a cheaper place than it is nowadays, I believe. And yeah,
and I should add that few are living there actually nowadays.
Actually,
because there are most touristic apartments for sure.
Yes, that's what I thought. That's what my friends from Lisbon keep telling me. And well, I was just thinking about the radical potentiality of emptiness, and what is empty could be recovered in a sense, can be negotiated back. Yeah, I know I'm jumping into a different question, but you know what? There is no such thing as a void in nature and in politics, and in that sense, we need maybe to stress out this radical, let's say, potentiality of emptiness, instead of this kind of emptiness that neoliberal strategies for the city wish to actually impose and introduce. And empty space is never empty. It's full of potentialities. It's full of possibilities. It's full actually of ways of reclaiming and inhabiting it back in an alternative manner. So yeah, just a final concluding thought, should say.
Thank you, Antonis. I think that's very interesting. The empty is actually full of potential. Malan Chung, I would like to ask you what you'd like to add on this closing answer.
Yes, thank you. For my opinion, I think there's a complicated communication between the built heritage and the architectural typology. The use of the subversive and the cooperative strategy. I think it is the relation of the scientific exploration with the social and political practice. And anyway, the relevant points and the interest within those principles could be met and understanding and could be learned and tested. And the learn and define the forms of typologic or programmatic reinterpreted by study on its space usage through the times, how the social and the political organization lead the form of the architecture, the use of the architectural space, and the public space change, the social movement, the core of the city in terms of the city infrastructure or the landscape extra. And the new social typology can constitute by trailing the micro-social intervention architecture. We can create a new form of architecture, define a vision of objective recovery, and on the usage of the space. Then the intervention will create or define the new types of the public use or the specific urban fabric. And yes, I think that's a good practice and we could learn from it. And it is the impact and what we should learn for the future or for the sustainable development, the future of sustainable development. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melon. I actually have a personal opinion that I would like to add before asking Vanya to give his final comment. Actually, South European countries have kind of a sacralized view on heritage. North European countries are less attached to building uses or pre-uses, and they are actually reinventing on top of existing buildings much more than the southern countries. I don't know what's behind this kind of approach, but it's something I feel we're experiencing Europe, for instance. Vanya, I don't know what you would like to add on this final questions.
Yes, on this problem of built heritage, I feel that especially in these parts of Europe, it's not only the problem of changing program of existing social condensers, but much more privatization and appropriation of public spaces, and especially in regions that are dominated by tourist industry. And life in those previous places of interaction are now being commercialized and mechanized, and I don't feel they're really places of interaction anymore. And at the same time, it's moving people from those traditional gathering places to new purpose-built venues that are often much less remarkable or they're even prosaic. Therefore, I agree with you that we should use those same reprogrammatic tools, but in a different direction as a way of rehabilitation of our building heritage. And concerning the new social typologies and trial and error systems, I don't know if a truly new social typology can be born or at least intentionally so. But I do think that existing ones are already going through processes of adaptation and mutation, and we should focus on those changing natures of use of our public buildings and the way we interact with them. So micro-social intervention architecture or targeted pilot program projects bringing some desired changing and experimenting for certain existing typologies would function as a way almost as a good viruses in existing built space, testing new ways of connecting people. And Here, I must say that I feel there is a problem today with the overregulated building practice as opposed to earlier times. There is more and more regulation standards defining each typology, defining aspects of building technology, being micromanaged every step without any overall coordination, and it strongly discourages experiments. Failures or errors in this way, especially in commercial life, are completely unacceptable, and failures or trial and errors are especially essential part of experimentation in any experiment-driven discipline, and only through them we can learn. And here I think we have a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. And now I would like to end this session asking Francesco to comment on the last question. Now you have the final words and the final question.
Thank you for the final word, but I think the time is expired, so I will be very short. Well, we talk a lot about the public space, which is really important, and why we are designing a building. Of course, we have to think about the void in between the space, because it's not void, but supposed to be a place with a name, a square, a park, an alley, wherever. So first of all, we should start to use again the word of the architecture, I think, in defining the spaces. The second thing is I believe that the pandemic tells us that we need to design houses, especially the low-cost housing complex, for with spaces that are not just comfort in terms of having a bedroom or a kitchen, but to have also space where to live in being a pandemic. But who knows that we will have other pandemic situation? I hope not, of course, but we learned that this will be possible. That was something that we not think about. So we probably have to rethink about the types of the building that you are, of the houses that you have to design after the pandemic. And I think that is the lecture we should learn of having been a pandemic, to think how the people, the people without with many possibilities, economical talking, to have a space where they can live in the right way. I'm lucky I was in a house of more than 200 square meters. I have my office here that are again 150 meters, and that was alone. But I know people that was living in 60 meters, being 6 persons, you know, and that's why they're getting crazy. They need to stay out. And this is because in the past, we thought low housing complex as just the existing minimum. This is not fair. I think we in Southern Europe, we should start to think to provide houses for better living. Not just to have a safety and a saving energy space, but a place where someone can live with his family, with relatives, in the right proportion of space, even there. And why not a terrace, a little outside space? I think this is the lecture that we can learn. And you know, like T.S. Eliot was saying that there is not invention without a critic to the tradition, but with the tradition we have to deal with. And then we can talk about what kind of tradition we need to criticize, but why we are still living or still using loggias. Francesco was saying that the loggia in Florence is used by the tourists, but during the pandemic was used by the Florentians because there were not anymore tourists. In Genoa, we have another big loggia built in the 16th century, and this is a wonderful space, a sort of covered squares invented in the 16th century. It's a huge space, open to the public. And this, I think, is typological or something that we can still use, for instance, in the new town as a common space. So I believe that the function doesn't change, doesn't follow the forms. I think this is something that was already gone many years ago. But we have to think about the forms of the architecture. Like I was saying at the beginning, to leave the people to act. We are actors acting in the town. So the town is screenplay, screen set where everybody should act and live to act as he wants. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. So we are completely out of time now. I would like to thank you all for your great inputs. I think the conversation was actually in a very nice rhythm. So I would keep on going, but we have now to stop and join the keynotes on the main event. Thank you so much. The conversation will be available on YouTube after, so the links will be shared, and hope to see you physically soon in another context. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Diogo. Bye to everybody.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to
Nice
meet
to
you.
meet you too.
Nice to meet you all.